Dear students, in the previous lecture I discussed the relationship between economic growth and environment. You have also studied the 4 functions of environment, and you have also studied how the economic growth lead to environmental degradation, or sometimes if the GDP growth rate is coming from the green sources, clean sources of energy, it may also help to protect the environment, because when GDP growth rate increases, the government may also get more funds, and these funds, even if the tax GDP ratio remain constant, and if GDP growth rate is increasing, more funds will be available to the government for investing in cleaning the environment. So, high growth rate may lead to better environment conditions in an economy. So, there is actually a debate on whether the environmental protection or environmental condition will improve with the increase in GDP or deteriorate. This relationship is discussed in the form of environmental Kuznets curve. This environmental Kuznets curve is actually based on the concept which was developed by Kuznets while studying the relationship between inequality and economic growth. So, environmental economists use the same concept. Kuznets tried to establish the relationship between economic growth and inequality, and according to Kuznets, in the initial stage of development, when economic growth increases, this inequality increases, but when the level of economic development reach at a particular level, after that further increase in economic growth or economic development would lead to decline in economic inequality. So, taking this concept, environmental economists try to establish the relationship between economic growth and environmental protection, and this relationship is termed as environmental Kuznets curve. So, you will study today this concept. As in the very beginning I told you that environmental Kuznets curve is based on the idea given by Kuznets. He developed his hypothesis taking GDP of different countries over a longer period and inequality, and after analyzing the data he observed a inverted U-shaped relation between inequality and economic development or economic growth. In the initial stage of economic development, inequality increases, and after a particular level of economic development, inequality start declining. Now, it is simply a hypothesis, and there are still lot of debate whether inequality has increased or decreased with the increase in economic development. I am not going to make a debate on this issue. My only concern is the same idea was taken by environmentalists to explain the relationship between economic growth and environmental protection. Here the main hypothesis is environmental degradation first rises as per capita GNP rises due to inadequate attention to environmental concerns, and then fall as more resources and greater attentions are given to the environmental concerns. So, this is the hypothesis that initially with the increase in per capita income or per capita GNP, environmental degradation started because less attention was given to the environmental concerns. But later on, as the income further increases, then environmental protection or environmental conditions improves, and probably because people started giving more attention to the environmental concerns. If this hypothesis is true, then environmental Kuznets curve suggests that environmental degradation in a country like India during the economic takeoff stage would be a temporary phenomena. This is obvious because different countries passes through the different stages of economic development. So, obviously when a country is passing through a particular stage of economic development and in the initial stage, if increase in economic development or economic growth is leading to environmental degradation, obviously after a particular point environmental condition improves. So, now in India we know that in many our cities pollution level is increasing, but after 30 years or 40 years when further GDP of income GDP or per capita GDP of the country increase, there may be a possibility that our cities become more clean, more environmental friendly as compared to today. So, many cities, I can give an example, many cities in India like Delhi are more polluted today than 3 decades ago. But reverse is true in case of major cities of the world, the advanced countries like Tokyo, Paris, Stockholm, London or many other European countries, big cities, they are now more clean as compared to 3 decades or 4 decades ago. So, important argument here is that since their level of economy has significantly increased and they have more resources to spend or invest on environmental protection or green sources of energy, clean environment, clean water, clean air, obviously the level of environmental protection will improve. This is the key argument as far as environmental Kuznets curve is concerned. In environmental Kuznets curve, a critical threshold level of per capita income is determined by many environmental economists, and they believe that after a critical threshold level of income, then environmental condition improves in different countries. But here this threshold level of income may vary from country to country and from pollutant to pollutant. In some pollutant threshold level may be say $3,000, in some cases it may be $4,000 or 5,000 or 12,000 etc. So, the threshold level of per capita income may vary from country to country and from pollutant to pollutant. And another important issue regarding the environmental Kuznets curve is the absence of long term time series data and a single measure of environmental quality index. If you look at the various studies done by the environmentalists, they take either this SO2 as an indicator of environmental quality or they take degradation of forest, but a comprehensive environmental quality index was difficult to take to establish the relationship between environmental protection and economic growth. So, this is a major flaw right now that no comprehensive study taking the long term time series data and the integrated or a comprehensive index of environmental quality, it is very difficult to take across cross sections of large number of countries. Moreover, how to determine the environmental Kuznets curve under the influence of various stages of environment and development is also major issues. For example, it would be interesting to explore how the shape of environmental Kuznets curve changes under the influence of say pollution control, withdrawal of some types of subsidies or restructure of industries. So, how the restructure of industries or withdrawal of certain kind of subsidies which are degrading the environment or population control measures adopted by any government are affecting the shape of environmental Kuznets curve. Now, you can look at this graph which shows the inverted U-shaped relationship between environmental Kuznets environment and GDP or income per capita. On vertical axis we are measuring environmental degradation or pollution, and on horizontal axis we take the different stages of economic development in terms of per capita income growth. And this graph is divided into 3 stages. First is pre-industrial economy. So, pre-industrial economy means an agriculture economy. So, obviously, when in any country agriculture is a dominant source of income and agriculture is traditional agriculture, the level of pollution would be low. But when we gradually move from agriculture to industries, like in UK industrialization occurs. So, we move from green agriculture jobs to the blue industrial job, then industrialization would lead to more pollution, generation of gaseous waste, solid waste, liquid waste, and that will increase the level of environmental degradation in the economy. But once we reach at the particular level of economic development, then the composition of economy will shift from industry to services, and of course, services are more eco-friendly as compared to industries. So, services and in fact, the nature of services over a period of time also change. Today in India, IT sector is one of the important sectors, around 8 to 10% of our GDP is being contributed by the IT sector, and IT sector is more cleaner as compared to manufacturing of certain kind of goods like cement or coal, burn steel or energy, etc. So, obviously, when we move from industry to services, then level of pollution should decline. That is an argument as far as environmental Kuznets curve is concerned. Now, I can give some explanation why this hypothesis in certain conditions may be applicable. First point is transition of economy from agriculture to industry and then to the services. So, this is one argument made by the analyst that over a period of time, with the increase in economic development in different stages, the economy shift from agriculture to industry and then to the services. So, these are the things which are responsible for application of or empirically validation of environmental Kuznets curve. Now, when there is a shifting or change in the composition of the economy, 3 effects may occur. First is scale effect, second is composition effect, and third is technology effects. So, these are very important points to explain the environmental Kuznets curve. Scale effect means when economy grows, more production is done in terms of quantity. So, quantitative addition of the production would lead to more generation of pollution. It is a simple principle. If we produce more, we release more waste. If we consume more, we release more waste. So, more consumption, more production means more waste released into the atmosphere. So, scale effect has negative impact on environmental degradation. Second is composition effect. When composition of the economy changes, it has some positive influence on the environment, offsetting the adverse effects of the scale. Obviously, that occurs after a particular level of economic development. Like I already given an example, when we shift from manufacturing to services, then this is a change in the composition of economy. Like in most of the advanced countries, 65 to 70% of our GDP is coming from services. In India also around 60% of our GDP approximately is coming from services. So, when more or more income is coming from services sector, then obviously the level of environmental degradation declines or environmental conditions improves. So, obviously another third point is technology. So high growth lead to R&D, R&D lead to new technology, and new technology lead to low pollution. So, you can establish the relationship between high growth of the GDP to technology and then pollution. So, there is a positive relationship between high GDP growth rate lead to better R&D, new technologies, and new technologies are more resource conservative in nature, more conservation occurs and reduce less pollution. So, environmental Kuznets curve suggests that while scale effect prevails in the initial stage of economic development, the composition and technology effect dominate in the later stage, resulting in improved quality of environment. So, these three effects, scale effect, composition effect and technology effect, in the initial stage of development, scale effect is more dominant, and that is why in the initial stage environmental degradation increases with the increase in economic growth. But in the later stage, composition of economy means shifting income from industry to services, and technology they dominate and they help to reduce the level of pollution with the increased GDP. So, this is the possible argument in favor of happening of environmental Kuznets curve. I can also give few more points why it happens. First is high income elastic environmental goods. We know as income increases, we demand more environmental goods and services. So, income elasticity of demand for environmental goods is quite high. So, obviously, when the economic growth of any country increases, household sectors or you can say the private people, they have more income to spend on purchasing the environmental goods. Although most of the environmental goods are non-rival and non-excludable, but some part of the environmental goods are also rival and excludable, and so therefore, like household garbage disposal. So, as your income increases, you want to live in a clean environment. So, a disposal company will come, emerge in market emerge, and people would be willing to pay to these household disposal companies. So, clean environment demand increases with the increase in income because of high income elasticity demand for environmental goods and services. Second argument is increase in government resources to invest in environmental protection. You know, when a economy grows, then even if the government is not altering the tax structure, if taxes remain same, the volume of tax received by the government with the increase in growth of the GDP will increase, and government have more resources at its disposal to make investment in cleaning the environment. So, government's capability to invest more with the increase in economic growth would lead to better environment conditions after a particular level of economic development. Third point, influence of environmental lobby in public policies. So, when a country grows, when economic development of the country increases, then environmentalist becomes more active. They also put pressure on the government. They also use as a lobby in the government to formulate the policies in favor of environmental protections. So, environmentalist also becomes more active, environmental groups. Then fourth point is role of judiciary. Judicial system also take action related to environmental protection. So, sometimes people may file public interest litigation on certain issues, and the court may also give favorable discussion, and through this the new policies or programs may be formulated by the government. And last point is international influence. International influence is also responsible, like trade and environment. So, when the economy of a country grows, then many consumers they also put restriction on certain kinds of goods where environmental conditions are not good. So, that is called environmental standards. In WTO, this is a major debate. So, how to bring environmental standard into the multilateral trading system. So, international influences also have some positive effect on environmental protections. Now, there are 2-3 pioneers in establishing this environmental Kuznets curve. One is Rogers. He tried to establish the environmental Kuznets curve by taking per capita income and SO2 emissions, and according to him, when the per capita income of a country crosses $3,000, then SO2 emission per capita in tons start declining. But he also examines that depending on the nature of environmental problem, there may be variation in this critical per capita income at which the environmental condition begin to improve. So, although on an average $3,000 per capita is the threshold income after which the SO2 emissions in major cities of the world start declining, but this threshold income may vary from city to city or even country to country. Second is Panayiotou, and first time he gave this concept of environmental Kuznets curve. He establishes an empirical relationship between economic growth and deforestation as a measure of environmental degradation, taking sample data from developing countries. He applied ordinary least square method to establish the environmental Kuznets curve, and on horizontal axis income per capita is taken in US dollar, and on vertical axis rate of deforestation is taken in percentage, and he found that at the per capita income of $823, the rate of decline of the forest is highest, that is 3.5%, and after that if the per capita income of a country increases, then rate of decline of deforestation also declines. Finally, let me sum up this topic. Growing income activity include both production and consumption, require larger inputs of energy and material and generate larger quantity of waste byproduct. So, that is why we should be more concerned about our production methods, consumption method, or how to increase our GDP. Second, increase extraction of natural resources, accumulation of waste and concentration of pollutant adversely affect the carrying capacity of environment and human welfare, even if the GDP of the country increases. That is why now many economists thinking about beyond GDP, and people are developing a new method of or new measures of economic welfare other than the GDP, because GDP is not a true indicator of well-being of the society. You can generate your GDP by cutting forest, selling it as a timber, or extracting more natural resources, polluting your environment, polluting your water, and generating GDP. So, this kind of process of generating GDP is not sustainable. That is why economists are now thinking of developing alternative measures of economic well-being of the society. Third is trade-off between the goal of achieving high rate of economic growth and attaining high standard of environmental quality. So, there is a trade-off between environment and development, and since there is a trade-off and resources are limited, we have to make a proper balance how much environmental protection we should achieve and how much economic growth we should follow to achieve the intended goals. And finally, relationship between economic growth and environmental degradation change sign from positive to negative as a country reaches at a high level of income, that is called environmental Kuznets curve. But as far as empirical evidences are concerned, most of the studies as I mentioned are either taking SO2 or forest degradation, but CO2 studies is also the important issue. And in terms of global warming, now all gases are clubbed together, and CO2 equivalent is taken in order to address the issue of climate change and global warming. So, how much CO2 is increasing or decreasing with the level of economic growth is a major challenge before us. Thank you very much.